Hello everyone, it's Nathan, and I'm going to be doing a game analysis of a game I recently played on the free internet chess server. If you're interested, the links to that site are in the description. My opponent's rating was 1922, and my rating was 1838. This game quickly entered a Sicilian dragon, and it shows just how quickly things can go wrong in the Sicilian defense if one makes the slightest positional error, and we will see what I mean by that very shortly, as the game only lasted 16 moves. My opponent opened with pawn to e4, and for the first time, I decided to play the Sicilian, pawn to c5. We now have knight f3, pawn to d6, and pawn to d4, striking at my c5 pawn. Takes, and already we have a very unbalanced, interesting position. White's bishops are all ready to come out along these diagonals. Black has just traded his c-pawn for White's better d-pawn. White has a centralized pawn on e4 and a centralized knight on d4. These slight positional subtleties is what both sides have managed to accomplish only 4 moves into the opening. We now have knight to f6 attacking the e4 pawn, and knight c3 defending the e4 pawn. This is all book, by the way. And this position here is almost known as like the mother position of the Sicilian defense, meaning that from this position here, we can have a whole bunch of different lines. We could have the Najdorf, pawn to a6, the dragon, pawn to g6, which is what was played in the game. We can also have pawn to e6, pawn to e5, or even knight to c6. So if you want to play the Sicilian defense well, you should know the basics of all of these lines. As I said, I played pawn to g6, where I'm hoping to get my bishop on this square, where it would influence this diagonal a great deal. This bishop, once it's on g7, is considered one of black's best pieces, and if that bishop can be maintained, it's a great asset for black. Bishop to e3, the Yugoslav attack, which is the most principled retort against the dragon. Bishop to g7, and now pawn to f3, looking to almost shut down my knight from accessing g4. If my knight can get to g4, it would be hitting the dark squared bishop. White doesn't want to give up the bishop for a knight, so that's why we're seeing pawn to f3. Also, it is securing the e4 pawn. I now castle kingside, and I have a very solid defense already, and White has centralized pieces. This is kind of what both sides have managed so far. Both sides have a very solid defense, and White can have good attacking chances with these centralized pieces. Queen to d2, forming a battery with the bishop along this diagonal, and in some variations, White's dark squared bishop wants to come to h6 so that it can trade itself off for my dark squared bishop, as my dark squared bishop is considered stronger than White's dark squared bishop. Knight to c6 development, castle queenside, getting the king safe, and in these openings where we have opposite side castling, meaning my king's castled on one wing of the board and White's on the other, we typically have a huge pawn storm coming with, Black will be pushing these pawns down the board and White will be pushing these pawns down the board. And it's almost a rat race, who gets to the opponent's king first, really. This did not happen in the game. My opponent played very logically, yet fell suspect to a tactic that was just crushing. Bishop to d7 development. There's not really a better square that this bishop can get on. If it comes to, say, e6, it's hindering my e7 pawn from moving, and at some point this pawn might want to get to e5, or possibly just e6. So bishop to d7 instead. And now my opponent played a dubious move in my opinion. He played knight takes knight, And the reason I assigned the word dubious to this move is the fact that I can recapture with the pawn and build a very strong center. I have an e-pawn, a d-pawn, and a c-pawn that can all help out in controlling central squares. And also, as a result of capturing, I now have a half-open b file where my rooks will function very well. My opponent now plays pawn to g4. If the pawn were to advance to g5 and kick my knight, I'm not really concerned about this, because my knight could then come and make use of h5, where it would kind of shut down white's h-pawn from moving. It's almost like a bone in white's throat, and it would be completely stopping the attack on my king side. I now play rook to b8, and if white wanted to, he could have come and picked off this a7 pawn. Let's look at the drawbacks of such a move. If white were to come and take, he's now giving me two half-open files towards his king, where my rook and queen will function very well, and I would get significant attacking chances for the pawn loss. So white decides not to do this, and instead brings his king to b1, and that was kind of the deciding move of the game, really. In this position here, as I ran it over with an analysis program, the engine favored white, yet after the king moved to b1, which seems like a completely natural move, looking to guard these two corner squares, the engine now favored black, and it by a significant amount. And this was just a normal-looking move. And the reason this move is bad is because it's putting itself opposite my rook. Granted, it is watching over a2 and a1, but it's opposite my rook. And if you want to look at it this way, this knight on c3 is now only defended by the queen, because this pawn is pinned. So if this queen gets a little bit too crazy and wants to move around and stuff, this knight will be unprotected and be suspect to my bishop, where it would then, my knight could move and my bishop would be attacking the knight, and it would be undefended because this pawn is pinned. I know I just spit out a lot of information, but I hope you get what I'm trying to say. The queen is tied down to defending the knight, which is in a good position. So, queen a5, getting my queen active, and just out doing stuff. Also, in some variations, it can defend laterally along the 5th rank. And my opponent played pawn to h4. Once again, a completely natural move where it's looking to play pawn to h5 and kind of put holes in my kingside structure. And here is the real knockout move. And if you want to pause the video and see if you can find it, it's a move that practically wins the game. Go ahead, pause it. Alright, the winning move, rook takes b2. I thought for about 4 or 5 minutes out of the 15 minutes that I had, as it was a 15-minute game, and I came up with rook takes b2. And the idea is quite simple. In my opinion, the best move white can make is to simply ignore the rook and play king c1, which is practically losing as well, because I could swing over and double rooks immediately, and we already have problems. However, white takes the rook. And if you would like to find the follow-up move, go ahead. Alright, the follow-up move, rook b8, check. And white has a few options here. His king can come to c1, that's the first variation. King to c1, which isn't good because simply queen a3 checkmate. So king c1 doesn't work. We could also see king a1. If we see this move, we can simply have knight takes e4. And it's attacking the queen first of all, and also revealing pressure to the knight on c3. So if the knight were taken, we simply have bishop takes knight, and this queen's going to be watching things from the sideline, as it's also attacking the king. So taking the knight doesn't work. If white tries to move the queen is going to have to leave the defense of the knight. It can't stay on this diagonal simply because the bishop will come crashing in. So let's say queen here. Well, bishop takes checkmate, and I believe I didn't point it out, but in this variation as well, it's just checkmate here, and game over. So king a1 doesn't work. We also have two more options. The knight can come and play to b5, and it's also revealing an attack against black's queen. However, we have a couple intermediate moves before responding to this threat. As a matter of fact, black never moves his queen. He doesn't have to. We simply have rook takes knight, and it's just completely winning. If bishop comes down takes, we simply have knight takes pawn, discovered check, and the queen's going to be lost. That's game over. And also, another option, which is what was played in the actual game, is instead of blocking with the knight, blocking with the bishop, and it just leads to the same thing. We just have rook takes bishop, knight takes rook, and knight takes pawn, discovered check, queen's lost. And that in this position, my opponent resigned, only 16 moves into the game. And just think about it, this knight move is lovely when first of all, my queen's undefended, and it takes a pawn, it captures a piece with discovered check, and wins the queen just in a nick of time before my queen is taken. It's just a lovely move, and facing this position, my opponent resigned. But if things were to continue on, we may have something like king c1 reacting to the check of the bishop, knight takes queen, bishop takes knight, queen takes knight, and something along the lines of this: check, king d1, check, bishop block, and it's just kind of done. Queen like d5, and now we respond to the threat with like bishop takes g4, and the bishop and this pawn can't take unless you want to lose your rook. So it's just going to lead to substantial material loss for white and eventually mate. So facing this position here, my opponent resigned. So I hope you got something out of this game. Questions and comments can be posted on YouTube. Thanks, take care, bye.